welcome this morning. I am coming for you from, sorry again, I am coming from a slightly rainy Manchester. We're at an NHS conference talking all things Azure, all things Microsoft Fabric, but also a lot of conversations around the topic that we're going to talk about today, which is Microsoft funding. And the purpose really of putting this together is to talk a little bit about what we're doing around funding, what your options are as an end customer, and the reasons obviously to work with us, with our partnership with Microsoft, and what funding actually translates into in terms of where you can use it and how you can maximize it from that perspective. So just a little bit about me, in case you haven't joined me on one of my webinars before. So I'm Chris Kirk. I'm the Hybrid Cloud and Data PS Director. I have cannot believe when I was looking back that I've been doing this basically 20 years. Time has absolutely flown, to put it mildly. So I have come from a technical background. On-prem and automation was the early part of my career, and then Azure automation, data analytics, enterprise AI solutions are very much the theme of my modern day career as well. So I run the delivery teams here at Trustmarque Ultima, giving value back to customers, working on strategy, go to market, and basically giving back to customers the maximum amount of value they can from their Azure, their data analytics, their on-prem, or their enterprise AI estates on that side of things as well. So in terms of today's agenda, basically I'm going to go through context and why now is very important, why particularly now is very important from a funding perspective. I'm going to talk a little bit about funding in terms of what's available today, because there are different funding programs for different things behind the scenes. It's not all one funding pot that's wide ranging. There are very specific avenues that we can explore, how that applies to different workload types, how we then use it in the real world. So I'm going to give you a couple of use cases where we've used funding in the past with customers to give you an idea. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can secure things like funded assessments, funded deployments from a professional services perspective. And then we'll do a little bit of a live Q&A in terms of any questions you may have, or the Trustmarque Ultima difference, as it were, in terms of what we bring to the party when we're doing these kind of funded engagements. So we start, obviously, at the beginning with a question, which is, why now? Why is now more important than any other time from a funding perspective? And the answers are pretty simple. Infrastructure and platform costs are increasing. If we take on-prem, for example, we're seeing price rises with new hardware, we're seeing long delays, and we're seeing more and more customers, while they are already in Azure, they're bursting into the cloud more and more to kind of offset that increase in cloud, in on-prem spend, or the delays that some customers might be experiencing, or they just want to add more value by using more modern features that the cloud provides. In amongst all of that, in terms of those pressures around cost and showing delivery back to the wider business, organizations are under tremendous pressure to reduce cost wherever possible, even though we're met with a lot of price rises for a lot of different scenarios out there. So what we do as an organization, being a premier partner of Microsoft, is we have access to a variety of funding programs that allows customers to utilize these Azure services, but basically build these services as projects and use consultancy, such as what we provide at Trustmarque Ultima, to be able to get you there and build those solutions to best practice and accelerate that journey and that ROI and that value back to the business at a much lower barrier to entry from a cost perspective. So you get the best of both worlds. You get expertise and acceleration into that value, but you're also getting funding that can go towards some of that professional services cost as well. So today is all about the different values of that funding can provide, how it all kind of fits together, and basically how we can really accelerate some of these projects for you by reducing that commercial barrier that might exist up front. So when we talk about funding, there is not necessarily just one funding program, one funding work stream. There's different funding programs for different reasons and for different services. And now at Trustmarque Ultima, we have been doing this a long time in terms of working with Microsoft. So we're pretty astute when it comes to being able to know how funding works, how to get the best out of it, how to get the most, how to provide the most direction from that perspective as well. So it all starts with mapping out requirements and your current location. So we need to understand, for example, are you migrating workloads from on-prem, for example, that already exist? Are you migrating things from other cloud, such as AWS or GCP? Or are you starting with something that's absolutely brand new in Azure in terms of a workload? And basically identifying what we think that targeting operating model is going to be for that particular workload on the Azure platform. We work backwards from that to basically estimate consumption. So when we build that workload out, what roughly do we think that consumption is going to look like for that particular workload over effectively a 12-month period at a minimum? What we then do from that perspective is we work backwards from that 12-month consumption to calculate a percentage of that spend that we can use for funding. And effectively, there are 3 core funding programs available for Microsoft Azure workloads, and that also includes things like Microsoft Fabric, as well as Foundry AI for the more enterprise advanced AI custom models that you might want to build as well. So we have Azure Accelerate, we have ESIF funding, which is End Customer Investment Funds, and we also have something that's relatively new, something called Azure Frontier as well. So Azure Accelerate is effectively T-shirt sizes. So we work out what that new workload is going to be from virtual machines or PAS SQL databases or AVD, for example, as well as Microsoft Fabric. And effectively that T-shirt size in terms of that consumption, when it falls into a particular threshold, we can then work out how much funding we can apply for professional services for that deployment. We also get access to assessment funding as well. So if you need to plan a migration, you need to plan a new workload into the discovery, and basically do a bit of forward planning or maybe a business case, we also have funding available to do that upfront as well around those virtual machines, PAS SQL databases, AVD, and Fabric. The reason I'm picking on those 4 in particular is because those are the most common workload types that we get involved in, and they're tried and tested from a funding perspective. So for ESIF funding is much more flexible in terms of what we can apply for. And effectively, the ratio is for every £10 of consumption that's going to generate, we're able to claim for effectively £1 of funding. And it means that if you have something that doesn't quite fit into Azure Accelerate in terms of your workload type, it may be other Azure services, for example, that you might want to use. For example, if you're building out serverless containers, app service plans, you're doing much more advanced I guess, very niche style services. That's where ESIF might come along and be a better fit for you instead of Azure Accelerate, which might not quite fit your requirement. There's basically a way of saying we have got you covered in terms of both directions as well on that. It's just on ESIF, it's a 10-to-1 ratio. And then lastly, Azure Frontier. So Azure Frontier is squarely aimed at AI Foundry and Fabric. Now, this is a brand new program from Microsoft that we have access to for these 2 particular workload types. And it basically is pretty generous, I have to say, from Microsoft at the moment. And that's for every £2 of consumption, we can claim £1 of funding for a Microsoft Fabric new instance or an AI Foundry new instance as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this as well. I'm just going to give you a couple of bits of details around these different funding programs, give you a bit more meat on the bones, as it were, in terms of the T's and C's and how we can apply it. So for Azure Accelerate, as I mentioned, this T-shirt sizes, the key to Azure Accelerate is we can't work with workloads that have already been deployed before we start the project or before we go to Microsoft to basically claim for the funding. It has to be not built or not tested. And basically, when we start the funding engagement, we start the professional services project, we claim on day 1 to Microsoft for consent. You will get an email to confirm consent. And at that point, we can then start the deployment. And that's basically because Microsoft will measure the consumption over a 12-month period to make sure it roughly matches what we think it's going to be from an estimate perspective. If that consumption has already started before we are engaged, therefore it doesn't apply because that consumption already exists from that day, and therefore they won't see the expected change from a consumption perspective. So in terms of, like I say, how we apply this, we have our proof of value, as I mentioned, discovery and plan. That gives us access to about $15,000 per project, and that covers discovery, planning out migrations, creating that business case, as I mentioned already. For the migrate and modernize deploy, to give it its full title, we can claim from anywhere between $2,000 to $75,000 per project or work stream, depending on the scope and the workload volume. So the way this works is we look at the consumption, and basically the consumption will fall into a range, and that will then fall into this is the funding you can claim. For example, $50,000 to $100,000 of consumption over a 12-month period, off the top of my head, that will fall into the $15,000 bracket for the migrate and modernize. So what that could mean for a project is if you are building a new workload or migrating a workload in our $50,000 to $100,000 bracket, we can claim for the proof of value, and we can claim $15,000 again for the deployment, and therefore we're claiming $30,000 of funding for that particular program, for that particular modernization or migration activity as well. To be clear, what funding is designed for is to cover the consultancy, the migration efforts, the design work, the proof of value delivered by us as consultants and our project managers. We have to be involved to be able to deliver these projects. What it's not designed for is to discount purely anything to do with consumption, licensing, hardware, and POCs. So POCs are not generally covered by funding, but if you want to do a long-term POC, therefore it's over 12 months, then at that point we could consider funding a POC in that scenario for that particular reason. But as I mentioned at the top of the call, the reason we're talking about this is we're trying to take your business challenges in terms of what you're facing and trying to unlock those challenges or remove those barriers in terms of those challenges. And I talk to a lot of customers about projects. I talk to a lot of customers about funding pretty much on a weekly basis. And what people are facing is basically what we have on the left-hand side. You've got hardware that is potentially out of budget. You're going to burst into the cloud instead. VDI and Citrix potentially has become too expensive, and you want to look at alternative solutions such as AVD. You've got a legacy data platform potentially on-prem, and you want to look at the more modernized solutions such as Microsoft Fabric or the Foundry AI solutions. And you may be under a bit of pressure to modernize and use newer features that are available from an Azure perspective and create a business case around that. Or you may not even have budget to do a business case, but you need one to basically prove the ROI. That's exactly what the proof of value funding is designed for. We are here to help you do a funded business case as well as planning that workload as well. We will give you the estimated ROI and TCO information as long as you've got a rough scope for us to work against to start off with. The scope is really important because we need to roughly calculate the consumption as well. It's also worth mentioning when we talk about data platform, I've mentioned Microsoft Fabric, but Databricks on Azure is also covered by this funding program. So Databricks is a third-party data platform solution. If you've not come across it before, it's been around for quite a long time, a bit longer than Microsoft Fabric, but it runs on Microsoft Azure itself. It also runs on AWS and GCP as well. But because it's a workload that runs on Azure generating consumption, it is included in that funding program as well in terms of that deployment on that side of things. So, a couple of real-world examples of just to give you a bit more of an idea of how this could maybe apply to you and your organizations. I've got 4 use cases which I've been intimately involved in probably over the last 12 to 18 months for these 4 customers. So we play a lot of verticals, and I've pulled out the 4 that are the most common verticals that we generally work with. So for NHS, we had a customer where they were planning on migrating a large chunk of their estate because they want to minimize their on-prem footprint. It's about 60% in the end of their virtual machines they were modernizing. They also had some 2016 legacy SQL servers that they wanted to move to Azure because it meant they got extended security updates with obviously 2016 SQL going end of life next month. So for them, we did a proof of value for the $15,000 that mapped out the migration plan, the risks, the criticality, and the validation, including a business case. That was at no cost to them in the end. That $15,000 covered it. And what we came out with was 65 virtual machines from dev to production, and they wanted to migrate. In the end, we were able to basically do that for no cost. We basically managed to cover that all through funding from that funding program for Azure Accelerate. It also opened the door for Microsoft Fabric as well. We've got ongoing conversation with this particular customer because now they're more in Azure, the business is more comfortable with it. It's opening up more opportunities for them to modernize on that side of things as well. You will see a commonality across all four of these examples. So outdated DR solution for my finance customer, aging colo and end of life hardware for my legal customer, aging SQL estate for my corporate customer. It's when you get to the end of life and a lot of these scenarios, and you're faced with a rather significant choice in terms of refreshing hardware or refreshing a reasonably large platform. That's where these are coming to life, to be honest with you. And all of these, we have done proof of value with business case. And for my legal customer, we were actually able to claim in the end approximately $110,000 of funding from Microsoft to do 80% of their cost of their migration. I think it was about 130 virtual machines in the end for my legal customer as well. And lastly, for my corporate customer, I mentioned SQL and SQL Server reporting services, or SSRS in particular, because we lifted and shifted that just to de-risk that for them. But then we did a further transformation into Fabric because they wanted to modernize their reporting with modern BI reporting as well. So again, we funded that migration as a lift and shift exercise, and then we're talking about more funding later on as we move into Fabric as well on that side of things. So in terms of how to get going with this, in terms of a general run rate of engagement that's most common across our customers. So we offer a no obligation 1 hour technical consultation with our customers. So if you have a workload in mind and you have a rough scope in mind, as in, it's X number of virtual machines, for example, on-prem, you've got the vCPUs, the memory, the disks that they're roughly using at the moment. And you want to look at your options, we can absolutely have a look at that for you to see what funding is available. Or even if funding isn't available, we obviously have the expertise to have a discussion around that as well. Potentially, then there's a funded assessment if that is needed for you. If you want to do some discovery, migration planning, architecture reviews, and business case, for example. And also, we then have a statement of work that we can produce off the back of that, and then we can produce a further statement of work to do the actual design and implementation funding. Again, that $2,000 to $75,000 for migration, modernization, AVD, and data platform workloads in particular. Those are the things that we concentrate on that side of things as well. So in terms of how we help customers and why us, why would you come to Trustmarque Ultima from a funding perspective when working with Microsoft? Obviously, a completely valid questions. So for us, in terms of the funding programs, we have been doing this for a long time with Microsoft. We have a very close relationship with the Microsoft account managers, the account executives, the sales specialists, and it's got to the point where we are very well versed in maximizing all the funding that is available. To the point on screen, when I was looking at the stats for preparing for this webinar, we have managed to secure $618,000 since Jan 25 in terms of funding that's been paid for projects for our customers. And the reason why we can do that is because of our designations and specializations that we have with Microsoft. So we are an infrastructure Azure specialist, we are a data and AI analytics specialist, and we're also a Fabric feature partner, and we're also an Azure expert MSP as well as having the specialization for modern work. The reason I'm calling these out is because you need to have these badges and these designations to be able to access these funding programs with Microsoft and work with Microsoft as a value-added reseller. It is not automatic that resellers have these funding pots available. You have to prove yourself to Microsoft that you know what you're doing, you know what you're talking about, and you are adding value back to customers as well. What that actually looks like from our perspective is we are audited 2 to 3 times a year for these specializations. We have to basically sit down with an auditor that's a neutral third party, and we have to basically show them the customer engagements we've done over the last 12 months for data and AI, for infrastructure in Azure, for modern work with AVD, and also for our managed services capability as well, hence the Azure Expert MSP badge. These are really tough audits to pass. They are very, very detailed audits. They take 2 to 3 days on average to do each audit. And that is what basically proves us to Microsoft and gives us access to these funding programs as well. So the funding programs in particular that we focus on the most at the moment, like I say, is AVD for modern work, Microsoft Fabric and Databricks on Azure for data analytics, infrastructure generalized workloads as well. And we're about to obtain areas around Copilot Studio, Power Platform, Power Automate as well on that particular area. But that's coming very shortly as well. But we also have ESIF funding to cover that area from today anyway, regardless. So when Microsoft come to us, or when you come to us as customers, it means that because we've done so many of these audits and we've got so many badges, we have much more flexibility in to be able to provide funded engagements back to customers as well on that side of things, as well as things like the Frontier funding as well, which is, I've got to just highlight that again, is a fantastic program from Microsoft where they really want to help customers with their Microsoft Fabric data platform, their BI reporting, their Databricks requirements on that side of things. Yeah, I work with a customer at the moment. It's going to be about 80 to 90,000 pounds of consumption for their Fabric requirements on an annual basis, but it means we think we've unlocked about 42 to 43,000 pounds of funding off the back of that as well. The last thing just to mention on this as well in terms of these specializations, and the reason why us again is we are able to understand the funding programs to such a degree that we can claim funding multiple times. So if I just go back to let's go back to my legal customer, for example, when I've said 80% funded, $110,000, obviously the eagle-eyed amongst you would have said, well, hang on a minute, Chris, you just said $2,000 to $75,000 as a range. How have you got $110,000 down there on paper? And the reason for that is because as long as there is separate work streams, separate projects, separate consumption that falls into thresholds, we can claim for funding multiple times when working with Microsoft. So in this case, they actually had 2 work streams that we could basically divide the consumption into, and it still hit certain thresholds in those t-shirt sizes, and it meant I could do a twice claim with Microsoft from a delivery perspective, and therefore we got way more funding than just doing it with one work stream as well. And that's pure experience. We have been doing this a long time. We've got a very close relationship with Microsoft, so we know what we can and can't do and how best to basically work through that funding as well on that side of things. The last thing I just want to mention before giving you some other areas that we're going to be exploring in the next few weeks is, while this is very much a call about Microsoft funding and the funding programs, it's just to mention that we're also designated and certified as a VMware Knight, which is equivalent to an Azure Expert MSP. We have great relationships with all the vendors you can see on screen. We do have expertise in AWS and G Cloud. We have a multi-cloud requirement, and we do have a relationship with Team and Rubrik on the backup and cyber recovery as well. So while I am talking to you about funding today, it was just to give you an idea of a much wider skill set, because when we're doing these funding programs, there might be a requirement where we have to understand a VMware environment really well. You might be migrating out of AWS back into Azure as a workload. Therefore, we need to understand the current operating model in AWS really well. And we have skills to do that. So that's the reason why I'm really highlighting it more than anything. We still need to understand the existing technologies, which we have in-house skill to be able to do that. Some additional areas just to make you aware of in terms of other engagement types that we deliver. If you were joining me on the previous webinar, I've obviously mentioned this previously on those webinars. So health assessments for Azure environments, we do a lot of well-architected reviews for customers, hybrid estate designs, including design reviews, we do a lot of work around that. Obviously, migration and transformation falls into what we're talking about today in terms of funding. But again, we're experts at transforming classic virtual machines into native Azure services. I will just add file servers as virtual machines into native Azure files is very popular at the moment. We're doing a lot of work around that because printers and file servers in my career have been the bane of everyone's life, and getting rid of virtual machines and the replication behind it, it just works. It's just a really good service. So we're doing a lot of work around that at the moment. But things like cloud strategy, optimization and best practice analysis, balancing costs of Azure versus performance. We have our own in-house tooling and in-house consultancy to be able to basically get the best bang for your buck in terms of your cloud estate as well, and to make sure it's all working as best as it can be as well. So just in terms of a wrap up, I just want to say thank you. I'm going to look at the chat in a second and stop sharing my screen just so I can see the chat in case there's any questions. I just want to make you aware that there's a couple of white papers which will share this content with you after this webinar that you might find quite interesting. So regarding hardware and price rises and options, my colleague Neil Dev, who is our technical pre-sales director, he has written a really fascinating white paper to give you some considerations around that. Infrastructure proactive planning from myself around reducing risk in cloud, around redundancy and options. There's a white paper around that. And in terms of that hybrid infrastructure question, in terms of how do you run a true hybrid environment, balancing on-prem and cloud, both myself and Neil are going to be doing a live webinar on that as well on the 30th of June. So if you want to have a look at options around VMware and alternatives such as Azure Local or Hyper-V and how they integrate into Azure, and you can get like a single pane of glass, I would love you to join us on that, where we're going to talk about what we've done in terms of use cases and what the best options are that we see it as today as well. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen just because I want to have a quick look to see if there's any questions as well. So just got a question around funding available CSP agreements. Yes, absolutely. There is no issue with any billing type whatsoever from Microsoft. Funding is available if you're landing things in Azure CSP subscriptions. That's absolutely fine on that front. Thank you for the question. Also, a question regarding, for example, I could claim the core, migrate and modernize post-sales funding, and on the other hand, data and AI and apps funding at the same project. Yes, so we would separate them out in terms of consumption, and we could do one work stream where we're doing migrate and modernize. There's more your virtual machines, your PAS SQL databases, and AVD, for example, and then we could have a separate work stream and a separate funding claim for Microsoft Fabric and data and AI related services as well. Absolutely, we can do that as well. We just have to look at what the estimate consumption is going to be, and then work out what the t-shirt size are by dividing that up as well on that side of things. Cool. I hope that makes sense. I'm not going to mention people's names just in case, but yeah, thank you. Yeah, no problem at all. Like I say, if you have a project in mind right now and you're in the midst of either early stage planning or you want some advice around that, I'm going to send some mail shots out after this call today/tomorrow. Would love to have a conversation with you about what we can do from a funding perspective and how that can apply. There's nothing really else for me to add for today. I'll just finish by saying I really appreciate you giving up a little bit of your time just to listen to little old me to give some advice around funding. Like I say, there's a lot of funding available these days, and yeah, we'd love to hear from you and get in contact if you've got any further questions. And yeah, whatever you're doing with the rest of your day, thank you very much, and have a great day. Thank you.